This is Brother Peter Diamond, vaticancatholic.com. I was going to be discussing the book called An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine by Cardinal John Henry Newman. I wanted to talk about some of the more interesting and important quotes and points that can be found in this book. Why is this book by Cardinal John Henry Newman important? Well, as some of our readers know, Cardinal Newman was a famous so-called convert in the 19th century from Anglicanism to Catholicism, and he was an extremely influential intellectual. And the topic of this book, the, quote, development of Christian doctrine, is an important concept to many modernists who use this concept in an attempt to justify the doctrinal novelties that we've seen after Vatican II. And in fact, in the foreword to this edition of the book, the foreword was written by Ian Kerr. It praises this essay, which is really a book, it's over 400 pages, and it says that it is, quote, a classic text for the theology of the development of doctrine, a branch of theology which has become especially important in the ecumenical era, end quote. And so they attempt to use this idea that there is a development of doctrine, which they think that Newman explained so brilliantly, to justify the modernization of Catholic thought, the novelties that we've seen, the false ecumenism, etc. So it's a very important issue in that sense, and Cardinal Newman, John Henry Newman, is also on his way to being, quote, beatified by the Vatican II sect. I believe that Benedict XVI plans to, quote, beatify him this fall. And so I want to talk about this book, and I want to talk about the positive and the negative aspects of it, because there are many interesting and positive parts of what he's written, in addition to, unfortunately, many passages which are simply incompatible with Catholic teaching and how a Catholic is bound to understand Catholic dogma. And so in this part I'll probably be focusing on some of the more interesting quotes from a positive standpoint, because despite the problems I will discuss, this John Henry Newman was an incredibly learned man who brings out a lot of very interesting things. And I guess the first quote I want to look at comes from page 127, and it has to do with the baptism issue. And a while back I did 2 audio videos on the issue of unbaptized catechumens and the delay for baptism, and I refuted the objections that unfortunately advocates of baptism of desire make, that because in certain parts of the early church there was a delay for baptizing catechumens, there would be certain periods where they would wait. That was because the church believed they could be saved without baptism, and I went through the evidence which refuted that and showed that that is not the case at all, that the delay is not from apostolic tradition as we see in the Acts of the Apostles and other things, and that it was not because the church taught or believed that they could be saved without baptism. And I gave the example of Pope St. Siricius, who observed the delay, but also taught that they cannot be saved even if they die desiring baptism and don't get it. But it's interesting that on page 127 of his book, An Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine, Newman discusses this delay, and he says, quote, as is well known, it was not unusual in that age of the church for those who might be considered catechumens to delay their baptism, as Protestants now delay reception of the Holy Eucharist. It is difficult for us at this day to enter into the assemblage of motives which led to this postponement, to a keen sense and awe of the special privileges of baptism, which could only once be received. Other reasons would be added: reluctance to being committed to a strict rule of life, and to making a public profession of religion, and to joining in a specially intimate fellowship or solidarity with strangers. But so it was, in matter of fact, for reasons good or bad, that infant baptism, which is a fundamental rule of Christian duty with us, was less earnestly insisted on in early times, end quote. And so what he's saying here is that it is difficult for us at this day to analyze what the motives might have been for them to delay these baptisms, as happened in certain cases. Well, if it was because it was believed they could be saved without it, he would have just said that. He doesn't. He says, he gives a list of reasons which could have led to the decision to do that. A sense of the awe and privileges of baptism which could only be received once, reluctance to being committed to the strict rule of life, etc. And so, even from this unfortunate modernist, he is also showing that it's an error to believe that the delay in baptizing catechumens, which arose in some places, was because the church held that they could be saved without it. Even he doesn't argue that. And expanding on this point, he makes the very interesting point that this delay was also to be found with baptizing infants. And on that same page and in the following pages, he says, even in the 4th century, St. Gregory Nazianzen, St. Basil, and St. Augustine, having Christian mothers, still were not baptized till they were adults. Okay, so he points out that these saints, even though they had Christian mothers, were not baptized till they grew up. Well, was that the apostolic tradition? That infants don't need to be baptized, or that they can be saved without it? Obviously not. It's a dogma that they can't be saved without it, and that they should be baptized. But that wasn't observed in all places, and these saints had parents who did not do that. And he goes on about this. It's very interesting. He goes on to talk about page 128. St. Augustine's mother, who herself is a saint, was a Christian when St. Augustine was born, though his father was not. Immediately on his birth he was made a catechumen. In his childhood he fell ill and asked for baptism. His mother was alarmed, and taking measures for his reception into the church, when he suddenly got better, it was deferred, meaning the baptism. So he wasn't baptized as an infant, but when there was a fear that he might die in childhood, measures were taken to baptize him, but he got better and it was deferred. And so the point here is that practices that might have arisen in certain sectors of the church, or even have been held by certain Christians, were not necessarily representative of the apostolic faith or the teaching of the universal church. That's why Christ founded a church upon St. Peter, so that he could rule the church, guide it, issue authoritative judgments, and sift through some of the false practices which arose in certain areas of the church. And so the point again here is how mistaken are those who think that because a theologian might have taught that, or because there's one statement from a father or a few statements from fathers, etc., that necessarily represents the teaching of the church, and they dismiss the authoritative teaching of the papal office. It's just another interesting example of how clearly they err. And he goes on to talk about this. In like manner, St. Ambrose, then brought up by his mother and holy nuns, one of them his own sister, St. Marcellina, was not baptized till he was chosen bishop at the age of about 34. Nor his brother, St. Satyrus, till about the same age, and after the serious warning of a shipwreck. St. Jerome, though educated at Rome and so far under religious influences, was not baptized till he had reached man's estate and had traveled. End quote. And so that's very interesting. Another interesting quote that I think is worth mentioning from this book comes on page 297 and 298. He's talking about the teaching of heretics. He's speaking of how there's some controversy about what a certain Monophysite believed, and he says that this controversy has arisen, quote, partly from confusion between him and his successors, partly from the indecision or the ambiguity which commonly attaches to the professions of heretics, end quote. And so he's actually speaking about the notorious heretic Eutyches, and he says that there's some confusion about what he believes, partly because of the ambiguity which is common to the profession of heretics. Again, showing that the truth that heretics always use ambiguity. They always contradict themselves because they're lying. And so when people lie, there isn't consistency. Even in their lies, there won't be consistency. And so of course they're going to contradict themselves. And so it just shows the folly, the diabolical folly of the people who will justify these notorious heretics if they say a few true or conservative things, even though they deny Catholic dogma the rest of the time. It's ridiculous. It's just a small example of that. And so in the next part I will continue with some more interesting things that I found in this book.